Welcome to another episode of the Political Potatoes podcast. I'm joined by Todd Achilles, who is an independent candidate running for the U.S. Senate. Welcome to the show, Todd.
Yeah, thanks, Craig.
So, for those who don't know you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, happy to, Craig. I'll start off with I did not win the Born in Idaho lottery. I grew up on a family farm in Oregon, and I was that 4-H kid showing the sheep every summer at the county fair. I spent a couple of years on active duty in the Army. I was a tank commander and a platoon leader, 2 deployments to the Persian Gulf. And then when I got out of the Army, I got into the tech sector. Spent 20 plus years at T-Mobile, Hewlett Packard, did a couple startups. Had a great run, ran billion-dollar global business units, and learned a ton. But just always had this kind of voice in the back of my head saying I need to return to public service. And after a great run at Hewlett Packard, I left. I got my master's in public administration. And the school there, UC Berkeley, asked me to stick around and teach some classes. And then did more and more public policy teaching. So class at Boise State, class at College of Idaho. And then when a slot came open in the Idaho legislature in my neighborhood, Boise, I raised my hand and I got appointed by Governor Little and served 2 years in the Idaho legislature.
So, what was it that inspired you to just that aha moment that said, you know what, I'm going to run for the Senate?
For me, Greg, it's a great question. I'm profoundly worried about the direction of the country and our ability to get things done. And it really doesn't matter what party's in power. We've got the same debt, division, and dysfunction. And we've got to get it back on track. I wore the uniform. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And that oath is still incredibly important to me. And I feel like I have a duty to continue to serve this country.
So, looking at your background, you've served, you've been in business, you've been a college professor, adjunct professor, you've taught students, you've had a really interesting life. And then you became a legislator, you were appointed to be a legislator, but then you left. You were a Democrat, you left the Democrat Party, you resigned your seat to become an independent. What was that like? I guess my question is, what inspired that?
Well, Greg, it was actually, I think the epiphany on this came when I was door knocking, when I was running for reelection on my seat in the Idaho House. And, my district is about 24% Dem, and I won with 60% of the vote. And when I was knocking on Republican doors, the number one thing I would hear after talking to folks is, man, Todd, you're a better Republican than that crazy on the ballot. And actually, I am. I'm also a pretty good Democrat too, in this tradition of somebody like C. Sanders. So what do these party labels actually mean? And what's important? My first year in the legislature, when I got there, I was talking to my colleagues and they would tell me, hey, some of them would tell me, hey, don't bother talking to that third of the chamber. You're never going to be able to convince them of everything. They're just, they're extremes. And I'm like, all right, well, you've been here 6 years. I've been here 6 days. Fine. And honestly, Greg, I didn't get a lot done for my constituents. I wasn't very productive in my first year, but my second year, after all those conversations with Republicans in my district, I made a point of getting to know absolutely everybody in my committees. And in some areas we disagree, in other areas we were on the same page and we could work together. And we got a ton done in my second year of the legislature. It's that bipartisanship. I think I had a reputation as being one of the most bipartisan in the building. That's what we need more of. We just got to stop this conflict for conflict purposes between the parties. We just got to get this country back on track.
So when you mentioned the crazy person on the ballot, you mean the other Democrat on the ballot, right? Or do you mean, I believe, the Republican?
The other Republican.
Oh, okay. So this evolution from being a Democrat to being an independent, and which I find really interesting because it's been happening quite some time now, where you saw individuals who were traditionally on the left, people who supported Bernie Sanders or who voted for Obama, shifting. And you saw, I guess the biggest one is like in the podcaster space or in some of the media space, like a Dave Rubin or Joe Rogan, Glenn Greenwald, or even like a Barry Wise, right? So these are individuals who were well known on the left or for being on the left, shifting to a point where they're embraced by Republicans, conservatives. In your case, what do you see as an issue with the Democratic Party that inspired you to want to leave?
Oh, well, I guess I'd start by saying 95% of the people that identify with either party are good people who just want to do the right thing. But I think you do see parties being captured by extremists, right? Whether side of the divide you're on. And I think these parties have gone deeper and deeper into their corners. And what that leaves is this big mass of Americans in the middle who were just saying, who's representing me?
Well, and you bring up a good point about what I would call the fringes of each side of the party. In Idaho, a big thing that we see on the Republican side is organizations, groups who are seeking to help a candidate or a group of candidates along need to create a fear-based narrative. So the left is trying to take over. They're trying to turn Idaho blue, this kind of thinking, which is false, right? The data shows otherwise. But that kind of bumper sticker level narratives, they play well with voters. So by framing you as, well, he was Democrat, he's still a Democrat, right? These are what your critics and the people running who see you as a potential threat to their campaign might say about you. My question is, how do you address that, right? How do you say, well, no, I'm not a Democrat, right? What separates you from actual Democrats, people who are actually aligning themselves with that party and on the ticket as a Democrat?
I think, Greg, step back from that a bit and just look at really what's going on right now. There's the massive political realignment that's happening in this country. The fastest growing group of voters in the US right now are independents, people that are leaving both parties. And they're leaving the Democratic Party faster than they're leaving the Republican Party. And when you look at some of the most important issues that are happening in Congress right now, maybe anti-monopoly work, the two leaders on anti-monopoly right now are Republican Josh Hawley from Missouri and Democrat Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. And they're both driving in the same direction, which is we've got to restore a competitive economy. We've got to break up these monopolies. Now, two people ideologically that are far apart, but when it comes to these core policy issues, they're on the same page and they're both doing great work. And this is the frustration in the political parties, right? 86% of Americans think Republicans, Democrats would rather fight than get something done. 86%. 2/3 have lost faith in the political system. 91% are exhausted by politics. There's a lot of Idahoans like that. And here's the one, honestly, in all seriousness, that really hurts. It's just 10% have hope for the future.
Mm.
I mean, that's not America, Greg. We can't exist in a country like that where people feel so disenfranchised and removed from the greatness of this country.
That's a really good point. I find that really fascinating, but I want to get back to when you get down to it, Republicans have a distinct advantage in this election because you're bypassing the primaries. I don't think you have a primary competitor because there is no actual independent
There's no
party. It's unaffiliated voters. So Republicans have the advantage because historically speaking in this state, a high percentage of voters don't make their decision of who to vote for until 24 hours before they actually vote. They just look at, oh, well, I think I'm a Republican. I've always registered Republican. My dad was Republican, or I like Trump, or whatever the reasoning is for that, having the R by their name. Well, this guy's an R, so I'm going to vote for them. Like they really know nothing about the candidate.
In fairness, Craig, people live busy lives. They've got a lot going on.
Yeah,
They're not nerds like you and me that can spend a bunch of time on these policy issues.
that's fair, right? Not everyone is paying attention. But I feel like more people should, right? We have issues now. We have people that are getting elected who, in my opinion, should never have gotten elected. But when you get into those bumper sticker narratives, they work and they're so easy to digest. It's like people are being told, what am I supposed to be mad about today? What am I supposed to be angry about today? Please tell me. And so when you're an independent, you're focused on nuanced issues. You're focused on telling the truth. You're in a position of integrity, but it's challenging because this is something I've brought up so many times. Nuance does not play well on social media. Anger, fear, divisiveness, that's what gets attention and gets people going. Now, to be fair, you're running a campaign with a guy who's been around a long time, but from what I've seen, he's not really engaged in any of that either, right? He's kind of like, oh, I'm just running it. I'm going to win because I'm the Republican, whatever. So I don't see a ton of that happening there. And I don't see him really backed or supported by, in my opinion, some of the most divisive people in this state because he's not really in their camp either. So it creates an interesting situation where you're running this campaign might be a great opportunity to see where Idahoans are at, where they really feel when it comes to representation at the U.S. Capitol. I guess my question here is, what does it look like if you, being an independent, wins this campaign? What changes? What does our representation look like? How does that affect how you'll vote?
Yeah, I think it begins with what are your priorities? What's your view on the role of government? I mean, the role of government is the welfare of the people. That's it. And what you see from both political parties is that they've been captured by incredibly wealthy interests, corporate interests, and so many in Congress have lost sight what their primary duty is. And, Greg, for me, this goes back to my experiences as an Army officer. In October of 94, I had given up my tank platoon and I was leading this great logistics platoon for my tank battalion, 86 men. In October, Saddam Hussein threatened to invade Kuwait a second time. And we were at the top of the alert cycle, so we got called in on a Saturday morning, and we all thought this was going to be another shooting. We didn't know what was going to happen. You're standing in formation on a Saturday morning in front of your troops with the wives, the kids, everybody else standing around, and it's burned into you, your duty to serve, your duty to care. And, that experience was 30 years ago, and I still get emotional when I'm talking about it. That's the essence of public service, right? That's the essence of what we need in Congress, is that passion to serve and care for the people of Idaho. So if you want to ask how things are going to change, I'll give some specific examples. Cutting Medicaid under the One Big Beautiful Bill disproportionately impacts Idaho because of our higher proportion of rural communities and rural hospitals. Because under Obamacare, we don't have a lot of big employers in rural communities, right? So how do people get their health insurance? They get it from the exchange. So when you cut Medicaid and you undermine the advanced tax credits in the exchange, you're materially impacting the well-being and the health of Idahoans. You can't do that, right? Yes, Obamacare needs to get fixed. It's broken. These health exchanges, the competitive marketplace isn't working anymore. But don't kill it by pulling the tax credits without fixing the problem. Do them in parallel. We've got to break up a lot of the big insurance companies and hospital chains that have taken over our healthcare industry and driven up prices. The big four meat packers control 75% of the beef in this country. We've had the Packers and Stockyards Acts for almost 100 years to fix the market concentration problem and return competition. Those are the sorts of things we need to do. We need to restore free markets, and we need to restore individual liberty that we've lost over the last 2 decades as Congress is becoming more and more captured from corporate interests.
So many Idahoans I talk to regularly keep telling me they're fed up, right? They're unhappy. They're really frustrated with all the divisiveness, the nothing getting done, and everything just keeps shifting towards what I'd call a solution in search of a problem. And so it's, once again, it goes back to these low-level narratives. They're like, oh, well, there's this and there's this. You need to be angry about this and everything else. And I appreciate what sounds like you're wanting to focus on real solutions to real problems. You talked about healthcare, right? I'm self-employed. I own a small business, and my health insurance went up significantly. I think it went up almost $400 a month, which it's not fun.
It's a lot of money.
It is, especially for
And
families.
why? Yeah.
Especially for other families. I'm fortunate enough to be able to absorb that, but there are other families that can't. That is a car payment. That is equivalent to 30% of their rent, a percentage of their mortgage. That's the difference between choosing between paying for something else that they need or having to just go without. And I've seen somebody post online, you know what? I can't afford health insurance anymore. I'm opting out.
Yeah.
And what does that do for families who actually have critical health needs? What solutions have you seen floated out there that you think could help this situation?
I mean, a lot of people talking about creating a single payer system like Canada or the UK. I don't think that's a good idea for the US because I think we have a fundamentally different system in terms of how we rely on federalism and we push control and leadership down to the local level. I do believe, however, that the intent behind the ACA or Obamacare was good, right? It was trying to get more people insured, create a bigger insurance pool than what they had before. And remember what it was like before. This whole term pre-existing condition. I had blown out my knee in college. So when I got insurance, my pre-existing condition is if I screwed up my knee again, guess what? It's on me. I'm paying
Mhm.
for it. And that's just a knee, right? I mean, what if I had a heart condition or something like that?
Right.
So I think that part is good. Eliminate those pre-existing conditions. But what we did is we created this whole new category of insurance monopolies. And then we had these pharmacy benefit managers, the PBMs, who are just jacking up prices and completely distorting the market for pharmaceuticals. Most of my career is in the tech sector, right? So you develop some software, version 1 is always going to have problems, and you're going to need a version 2 right behind it. We need a version 2 of the ACA. But just pulling the subsidies without fixing the underlying system is just hurting everybody. And that goes back to the role of government as the welfare of the people, because you're just hurting folks. And you're hearing the same stories I am, Greg, and people are angry.
I agree, they are. And you would think that anger would spur a desire for change. And here we have you running against a candidate who's been in, how long has Rich been in there now?
He got elected to the Senate, or he started serving in the Senate in 2009. He first got elected in 1970 when I was 3 years old.
He's been serving a long time. And, for his service, right? We appreciate he's done because he's done a lot. He's served as governor, a number of positions in Idaho before becoming the senator.
Long time in the legislature.
And you know what?
Lieutenant governor.
Good for him. Appreciate all that he's done for this state and serving. And I think there's an appetite for some people, especially those who feel like maybe we should look at term limits, things like that, that we should have a refresh every so often, just because, not because we don't value experience, because experience is valued and there is a need for that. But there's also a need for new experience, especially with new perspectives and experience in areas where, for instance, you worked in the tech sector. We have, I think, a huge issue coming up over the next few years, and that is the rise of AI and other huge technological leaps that, in my opinion, are going to affect policy and everything else coming up over the next 10 plus years. That kind of experience working in sectors, having a better understanding of that versus having to rely on this person's, I don't know how many 80 plus year olds understand AI, what goes in behind it versus someone else, or relying on, well, I'll just hire someone to tell me what to say or do.
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea, but I want to know from your perspective, where do you see your experience fitting in and what is your advantage here to voters?
Yeah. And I think, as I studied Jim Risch's career, I mean, he's served a long time. He's contributed a lot to the state, but we're in a very different time now. One of Jim Risch's priorities is the national debt, which is one of my priorities. We absolutely cannot let the national debt continue to grow at the rate it is. When he entered the Senate, it was $10 trillion, and that everybody had their hair on fire about that. We just passed 38 and we're on our way to $40 trillion. It's now the number one, almost, it's going to surpass and be the number one budget line item for the federal government, more than the Department of Defense. We can't sustain that, Greg. That's going to absolutely bankrupt this country. If the national debt has been one of your priorities for the 16 years you've been serving in the Senate, and it's gone from 10 trillion to 40 trillion. Listen, when I was at Hewlett Packard, if I had that kind of quarterly performance, that would have lasted like 2 quarters there, and I would have been out. I mean, if you can't fix it, then let somebody else come in and fix it. What you said about AI and the digital economy is incredibly important. I've got 4 patents. I've been on the leading edge of a lot of things within networking and wireless. We are absolutely getting exploited by these predatory digital companies that now basically tax us for everything we do on the internet. Remember, I think you're probably old enough for this. There was a law that you could not share what VHS tapes people checked out. Look at what's happening in the digital economy. That law is still on the books. But these digital platforms know absolutely everything about us, where we go, where we click, where we hesitate for 2 seconds when we're scrolling through our social media feeds. The lack of privacy and protection of personal rights digitally, there's none. And this is the kind of stuff that we need to fix.
Well, and that's why nobody can hide from Columbia House anymore. Of those old CDs and tapes you'd get.
Actually,
I am old enough to remember that. No, you're absolutely right. Where we used to value privacy, we used to value these individual freedoms. I could know that the government is not listing everything. And now it's not so much the government, it's private companies. And then what connections do they have in sharing that? Where are they sharing that? Unless you want to read a 500-page book called The Terms and Conditions, which are full of some really fascinating and frightening things. There's actually some really interesting books written about these terms and conditions of what they put in future things of where they want to go into this. Like, oh, by the way, you're signing away these rights to the likeness of your children, right? Anything that comes
yeah,
on, like, yeah, we own
yeah.
those rights, so you can never sue us for that. It gets scary when you actually pay attention. And that goes back to the earlier point. People aren't paying attention, listening or doing the research. And as a voter, as someone who's trying to pay attention and educate voters, that's concerning. What do you say to voters? What do you feel like needs more attention that's not getting that right now?
I think there's two things that I've heard, and I've been to all 44 counties. I've held over 60 town halls, great conversations in every corner of the state. And I'll tell you, Greg, I got, as I like to say, red hats, truckers' hats, hard hats, and cowboy hats showing up to my meetings and my town halls. The most exciting thing about this is we got Republicans and Democrats and independents sitting around the table having a conversation about how we get this country back on track. And the two things, everybody agrees on this. Congress is corrupt and the economy is rigged. And those two things are what is making it so hard to live in Idaho right now. And when we talk about solutions for the corruption in Congress, we need term limits. And I've signed the term limit pledge. I will not serve more than 2 terms, 12 years as Idaho's next senator, period. And we've got to do that. We've got to get more turnover, to your point, and more fresh blood in Congress. We've got to get the money out of our elections. I mean, the amount of money being spent now is just off the charts. And when you combine that with the wealth concentration now, particularly at the very top in the U.S., it's really dangerous. And I'm going to find this stat here. If you look at the top 1% and what they spent on elections, the wealthiest 100 families, their political spending has increased 140 times since 2000. So in 2000, the wealthiest 100 families in America spent $7 million on campaigns, $7 million in 2000. In 24, they spent $1.1 billion.
Wow.
And so if that's the money that we're spending in our elections, how much of these candidates representing the people versus these moneyed interests? And when I'm talking with folks in these town halls, I hear this a lot. I mean, it's similar to what I heard when I was campaigning. It's like, Todd, you're a pretty good conservative because you want elections to work again. You want the political process to work. You want to restore free markets and competition and break up these monopolies. These are conservative values, right? There's nothing more conservative than defending the free market from monopolies. And if you're taking money from the monopolies rather than trying to break them up, that's not conservative. Those aren't Republican values. And that's why I think we've got this massive realignment among the parties, because in Congress, you've got a lot of people that are beholden to the moneyed interest that got them elected. And then you've got this small group that are busting out of that and focused on the issues. They are truly committed to the Constitution.
So what do you say sets you apart from the current incumbent from a policy position?
I think there's a bunch of things. Let's start with the national debt. I think the current incumbent is stuck in the 80s and kind of a Reagan era when government was way too big and we stifled free competitive markets. But we swung the pendulum so far the other way now that our national debt is more of a revenue problem than it is an expense problem. And yes, we need entitlement reform. We need a lot of stuff going on that side. But listen, I paid more tax in 2022 than my old employer, T-Mobile, who's the largest mobile operator in the United States. That's wrong. The loopholes, the carve-outs, all of this stuff that's happening, that's undermining the revenue that we need to run good government, pay for our military, pay down the debt, is just off the charts. And at 28% of unpaid taxes in America come from the wealthiest 1%. So we've got to close these loopholes. People have a duty to pay their fair share. I think that's one. We absolutely need to fix the healthcare system, which means not unplugging it and just letting everybody drift, but consciously fixing Obamacare. Let's address the issues that are developed over the last 15 years, come up with Obamacare ACA version 2, and restore competitive markets, break up these vertically integrated hospitals and not take campaign donations from them. You don't want public lands. Listen, 98% of Idahoans all agree that we don't want to sell our public lands. If you're willing to vote to slash the budgets of the Forest Service and the BLM, then you're no supporter of public lands, right? We need to fully fund those agencies so they can be the stewards that we want to take care of our lands for future generations. So that's three right off the top. Great.
If voters are generally satisfied with the current senator, what's the strongest argument for replacing him?
Well, I challenge you on that first point.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that the logic for replacing him is we've got the fourth oldest and the seventh richest senator representing Idaho. And as we just talked about, the challenges of the next 20 years are not the challenges of the last 20 years. We need to understand, we need to get this digital economy functioning again so that average Idahoans aren't exploited by the big media platforms. We've got to address this affordability issue. Idaho used to be a low cost and a moderate kind of medium wage state. Now we're a low wage, high cost state. Folks can't afford to live here anymore. And that didn't just happen. That's a function of policy decisions over the last 20 years that have created that affordability crisis. These are the things that we need to attack and unwind and just make it possible for families to live here. More than 20 years running billion-dollar global operations in the business sector. My opponent doesn't have any of that business experience. And I can tell you what's happened is we've moved from healthy competition, companies trying to make profits to be able to grow, to now where we have very little competition and kind of an extractive business model. Too many companies are trying to see how they can make kind of super profits and goose their margins at the expense of their workers. And I'll just tell you one story. I was driving back from a town hall in eastern Idaho, and I stopped off to fuel up my van at a Sinclair station. It was late at night, like 10 or something, and a woman about my age was managing the store. So we just started talking. She's making $19 an hour. That part of the state, $23 an hour is a livable wage for a single person. She's making 19. So she's already underwater. She's been managing C-stores for over 10 years. No health insurance, no dental insurance. It was clear from looking at her, she hasn't had a chance to see a dentist in I don't know how long. And she's just barely getting by. In fact, if it wasn't for the social safety net and food banks and other stuff like that, she wouldn't be getting by. So the next morning, I looked at Sinclair's 2024 financial reports. They did $29 billion of revenue, and they had $1 billion of net income. And what do they do with that net income? They spend it on share buybacks, right? So that net income went to their institutional investors rather than going to their employees. And if you just look at all the employees that they show on their financial report divided by $1 billion, that was on the order of probably $8,000 or $10,000 per employee. 20 years ago, Greg, corporation was a family, right? They had a duty to their employees. Now a corporation is just about goosing their stock price, and they don't give a shit about their employees. Where are the values that we held?
You bring up a really interesting point because I remember a conglomerate like a Walmart, and you see this narrative in Idaho about, oh, we need to take all these people receiving SNAP benefits, right? We got to take away their ability to use that for soda and candy and everything else. Okay. But who are those people? Well, how many Walmart employees are using SNAP?
Yeah.
A lot.
It's a lot, Greg. And actually, this is some research that I asked to do about a year and a half ago, because everybody in the legislature, my colleagues, were concerned about the growth of the Medicaid expansion population. I'm concerned about that too. Right? We can't just keep growing these social safety net programs. But my question was, all right, Medicaid expansion. So they're making money. They've got a job. They're making too much to be eligible for Medicaid, but not enough to be eligible for the health exchange. So where are they working? And it took the Department of Health and Welfare about 6 months to be able to do this. They compiled all the data for me. Number one employer, to your point, was Walmart. Number two, Amazon. Number three, McDonald's. And a lot of what they're doing is they're manipulating the full-time part because under Obamacare, if you're full-time, the large employers have to provide health insurance. But if you're part-time, less than 30 hours, they don't have to. So what they do is they cap the employee's hours at 29. So they get kind of the benefit of the worker, but they don't have to have all these costs to take care of them. But who's picking up those costs? Greg, it's me and you. It's Idaho taxpayers, right? And by my estimate, based on this data from the Department of Health and Welfare, 1 in 8 Idaho Walmart employees, associates, gets their health care from you and me, from the state. 1 in 8. And when you look at Walmart and you look at the metrics of how big it is, 27 stores in the state, they do over $3 billion of revenue in Idaho. They probably ship back to Arkansas $250 million of profit. And they're the number one employer for folks on SNAP, on Medicaid. This is the sort of extractive business model that's unacceptable. And I'll say, like, when you look at the founder of Walmart and you read his biography, and it's really interesting, but he loved his employees. He had his little plane. He'd fly around all parts of Arkansas back in the early days, and he would just spend the days with his employees. And it was the corporate structure that he kept super lean so he could take care of his employees. And that's completely gone now.
It's interesting because some of the loudest voices in our state talking about, oh, we need to cut spending. We need to raise the budget and end property taxes and all these other things. Like, let's cut off any sort of funding to the government and whatever. Okay. But not once do you ever hear them talk about what I would see as real issues of, we want to kill Medicaid expansion. We want to kill these things because they're just bleeding us dry. Why should we pay for this? But they don't address the issue here, which you brought up very clearly, which is employers are, I feel like, these major employers are from out of state. Once again, this is an out of state problem. Coming to Idaho and raiding and exploiting our taxpayers to supplement and pay for their employees because they don't want to. They can fix this problem. So basically, a lot of our budget shortfalls are coming from out-of-state companies not taking care of their employees.
Yeah. Walmart, Target, Amazon, McDonald's. Now, what's important on this is who's not on that list, Greg? Micron's not on that list. Chobani, Amalgamated Sugar, Value-Wide, Schweitzer Engineering, Costco, right? These are employers who are doing the right thing. They're taking care of their employees, and they understand that they have an obligation to their employees, to their communities, and to the country, not to exploit, but to contribute. And these exploitive corporations, a lot of them out of state, what they do is they're distorting the free market even more so, right? So how do you, if Walmart's playing all these games and shifting all these costs away, that increases their profits. That makes it even harder for a company doing the right thing to be able to compete against it. And I saw this all the time when I was at Hewlett-Packard. I competed against these Chinese electronics manufacturers. They had no respect for the software that they put on their devices. They never paid the software licensing fees. They never paid any of the intellectual property costs. They didn't go through the certification on the batteries and the hardwares and all that other stuff that we would do. My bill of materials on one of my consumer products would be 30 or 40 bucks higher because we were trying to do the right thing, because we were Hewlett-Packard. We weren't going to race to the bottom against these Chinese manufacturers. And it's hard, man.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. So what ideas would you present for rewarding the employers who are doing it right? How do we encourage companies in Idaho specifically to do the right thing by their employees, which would then have a net benefit to all Idaho taxpayers by alleviating that burden on them?
It's a good question. I think in public policy, you want to stop the bad before you incent the good. So what we need to do, I think this goes back when we're talking about healthcare and exploiting the Medicaid expansion program. This is where we've got to revise Obamacare, revise the ACA, eliminate that full-time, part-time line that got negotiated 15 years ago. And listen, if you're working 30 hours, you're still contributing to the profits, and the employer still needs to take care of you. Companies that continue to play this game, we should go after them. Idaho should go after them and make them pay penalties for their employees that can't get by. I think we need to have a deeper conversation about what is a fair wage, right? Because if you're single, no kids, a livable wage in Idaho was on the range of kind of 23 to $26 an hour. And by my guess, about 60% of Idahoans don't earn a livable wage. If you've got 2 adults and a kid, a livable wage is on the order of about 35 to $45, kind of somewhere in that range, depending on where you are in the state. With these really low wages that we have from out-of-state employers, in particular, Walmart's average wage in Idaho is $18. So $18, but 23, 26 is a livable wage, but Walmart's paying 18. And while they're doing that, they're taking a ton of profit out of the state.
Mhm.
We've got to make sure that these employers are paying fair wages to their employees. And then I think we've just got to take a hard look at kind of what's happened over the last 20 years or so, which is, a young family, there's no way they can survive on one wage unless they're really fortunate professional, which then gets into, okay, now we have to have a 2-wage family. Not both mom and dad need to work. And then you have a whole series of costs associated with having a 2-wage family.
Mhm.
You got to get a second car. You got to do childcare. You're paying for more gas.
Let's
You've
not
got
talk about
all these
daycare
other
yet. That's a whole other issue right now.
Exactly. So this is the frustration that I hear
Mhm.
again and again, Greg, all around the state. It's like, man, you guys aren't listening to us. If you're a millennial or Gen Z in Idaho, the idea of being able to achieve the American dream, I mean, it's largely out of reach for most folks. And that's wrong, man. That's a function of policy. It didn't just happen. It was policy that got put in place, and we need to wind that back.
So you bring a really interesting point about the disparity of wages, the cost of living. But when we look at cost of living, it actually brings up another interesting argument because you see, we go once again more conservative thinking to more, liberal thinking. People on the left say, well, we need to raise the minimum wage. Okay. But the numbers you told me, Walmart's average wage is $18 an hour. Minimum wage is what, $7.25, $7.50. But it's been stuck there for decades. Okay. But the wages did go up, but they had to go up because the free market required it. Because at $8 an hour, you cannot live on that. It's just impossible because costs have gone up and they've gone up exponentially, especially with inflation over the last few years, especially post-COVID, things just went nuts. Everything got expensive. Double, tripled prices. Housing costs jumped. So is part of it not just the market forcing employers to pay more, but also what do we do about bringing some of these costs down? Because it feels like things have gone crazy. Costs are out of control. So what's the solution there?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Greg. You got to look at both sides of the equation. You got to stop these exploitive employers who get away with paying their folks unlivable wages, number one. Number two, you got to address the cost of things. I'm proudly a capitalist, Greg. I've run billion-dollar business units. The way we keep capitalism working is with competition. Everything works with competition. Prices come down, products innovate. We find more ways to reduce the inputs and the process to make goods. One of the bills I brought in the Idaho legislature last year was a prohibition on algorithmic price fixing. And that's particularly relevant in housing and in apartment housing. So what happens is you've got over the last 10 years or so, these companies that are middlemen that sit in the apartment housing industry, and they basically have pricing algorithms. We've seen a whole bunch of national property managers come into Idaho, buy up a bunch of apartment buildings. So there's less and less competition. There's fewer kind of state owners, and it's more these national ones. Let's just say the 6 biggest in the Treasure Valley, they'll share their information on pricing, on occupancy, on everything else with this pricing algorithm company. The biggest one is called RealPage. RealPage will crunch all that confidential data from all the different property managers in the market and then spit out pricing recommendations. So you and I are competitors. So there's this third party, you share your confidential information with them. I do the same thing. They crunch all the data and they say, Greg, you can increase your prices by $100 a month. Todd, you can increase yours by 150. Leave 10% of your units vacant.
Wow.
So what they're doing is completely manipulating the market by keeping supply tight, which then gives them more leverage to increase prices. And when you've got more than, say, 15, 20% of the units in the market behaving like this, that's price fixing. Then you've manipulated the market. And again, I saw this when I was knocking doors. I have a lot of apartment buildings in my district in Boise. And Greg, I would talk to these young couples who would tell me these awful stories. They hit me for $100 last year. They're going to hit me for another $100 rent increase this year. My paycheck hasn't changed. We got nothing else. If this happens one more time, we're out and we're going to be homeless. And you hear these stories from different apartment buildings by different companies. And I've been in business long enough. I'm like, my God, there's price fixing going on here. And this is why rents in the Treasure Valley and up in Coeur d'Alene have increased 3 times faster than inflation since 2000.
So it sounds like a big part of your message to voters is you want to find solutions to prevent exploitative behavior by corporations, by companies, by out-of-state actors who are seeking to profit from Idahoans, from the bottom on up. Would that be an accurate statement?
I think you're there. I changed a little bit.
Sure.
I want to restore a free and fair economy, and I want to stop this corporate socialism that's going on.
Okay. But I think that's a great message. And you don't hear that message very often. And I appreciate that that's being said. So many people I know go to the store, they look at how much they're spending with the cost of things. They look at their paychecks. They look at their pay stubs and how many things are being taken out of the paychecks. People don't like to pay taxes. We have, I believe, as citizens, a duty to pay for the things we use. We use the roads. We use the infrastructure. These things cost money. We understand that. And I think it's fair to contribute to that. But finding out that our money is not well spent, it's being exploited, and these costs are going up because of unfair exploitation, that seems like something that needs to be addressed.
Just building on that, in these town halls, particularly, I think Idahoans under 40 or so, I hear again and again, man, I'm making more, but I'm earning less. I just see this gap.
So what do you see as the proper role of government here?
The proper role of government is to restore a competitive market, restore competition, break up monopolies, stop this exploitation, this corporate socialism, and get a free and fair economy, a competitive market functioning again.
Okay.
We can't come in with price fixing or price controls or rent caps or something like that, because that completely distorts the market. But then on the other side of the pendulum, you can't just allow these companies to manipulate the market, exploit renters or people buying eggs or a third generation family cow calf operation that only has, 2 meat packers they can do business with. These are what undermine an American's ability to work hard and benefit from working hard and moving ahead. I'll tell you, Greg, there's a ton of parallels between what we see today in our highly concentrated wealth at the top and the Gilded Age in the late 1800s. When the Gilded Age really peaked at 1898, 1900, and Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt was the first trust buster to start breaking them up. You had the same kind of political realignment happening. And what's interesting, my old office in the Idaho Capitol, there was a picture of the 1898 Idaho House of Representatives next to my door. And there's some characters on there, as you would imagine. But what was really cool, though, and just fascinating, is that there were 4 political parties listed on there. There were the Republicans, the Civil Republicans, the Democrats, and the People's Populist Party, something like that. And some reps, since they had this kind of fusion system, some reps are part of 3 parties. But even you had William Borah, right? One of the greatest Republicans in the history of the state. He split from the traditional Republican Party, became a civil Republican, because civil Republicans more friendly to ag. They wanted looser financial system. And so you had this big mashup when the political parties no longer represented the economic reality. And it was like that for 6, 8, 10 years, and then things kind of settled back down. But I would argue, Greg, that we're in that same sort of period right now. When the old party alignments, you've got corporatist Dems and you've got Dems focused on workers. You've got corporatist Republicans and you've got Republicans focused on workers and economic opportunity and protecting free markets. And it's those sides of the ledger, which is where I represent and why this is the time for independence.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the show, answering these questions. I know I didn't exactly make it easy on you, I'm sure. And that's okay. We need to have these open, honest dialogues because we're in a state, as I addressed before, we have a voting population that leans right. And my last question to you is, what's your final message to a voter who voted for Senator Risch last time?
Well, first of all, Greg, I just want to say how much I appreciate all you do to improve the discourse on policy and politics in the state. And I know you do some great work. I know you've taken a lot of heat from some of the fringe folks. And I just appreciate that you guys just keep charging along. So thank you for that, because I think all of Idaho benefits from it. My message to somebody who voted for Jim Risch in the last cycle is it's time for change. Are you better off? Nobody in Idaho is better off. More and more Idahoans are struggling to get by. We've got representation in Congress that doesn't understand the real struggles of Idahoans and what we need to do to get the country back on track. You need somebody who has led troops in difficult situations and understands the duty to serving the Constitution and not taking politically easy votes, but taking the votes and representing Idaho in a way that's true to Idahoans and it's true to the Constitution.
Well, thank you, Todd. I really appreciate it. Thanks for joining the show and thanks for all that you do.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate the time.